You want to know about the outlaw gangs that history tried to bury, and you're about to discover why they were too dangerous to remember. Picture this: a cozy family, and where travelers stop for the night, but underneath the floorboards lie the bodies of every guest who ever checked in. This isn't fiction. This was reality. While the Wild West gave us legendary outlaws, the most savage gangs never wanted fame, they wanted complete control. These weren't romantic rebels riding into sunsets, but what transformed ordinary people into systematic killers? Could entire communities have been unknowingly harboring mass murderers for years? Today, we reveal the top 15 most terrifying outlaw gangs that history tried to forget. From family murder businesses to corrupt law enforcement rings to guerrilla terrorist organizations. Let's go on investigation. Number 15, the Innocents. Starting our countdown with a gang that perfected the art of hiding in plain sight. The Innocents weren't your typical band of highway robbers. They were a secret criminal society that infiltrated the very heart of frontier society in Montana Territory during the Gold Rush. Led by Henry Plummer, who incredibly served as the sheriff of Bannock, this gang turned law enforcement on its head. During the day, Plummer enforced the law and gained the trust of honest citizens. By night, he coordinated a network of over 100 road agents who robbed and murdered travelers along the territory's gold routes. What made the Innocents truly terrifying wasn't just their violence, it was their intelligence network. They had members working as store clerks, saloon keepers, and even deputies. When a wealthy miner prepared to leave town with his gold, the Innocents knew about it before he even packed his bags. They used a complex system of secret signals and coded messages to coordinate their attacks. Their most audacious operation was a systematic campaign against the gold shipments from Alder Gulch. Over a single winter, they murdered over 100 people and stole hundreds of thousands of dollars in gold. They became so bold that they started leaving calling cards at crime scenes. A simple 3777 scrawled in blood, which became their terror signature. The Innocents only fell when vigilantes discovered their secret and organized the famous Montana Vigilance Committee. In a swift campaign of frontier justice, they executed 24 gang members, including Sheriff Plummer himself, in a single month during the winter of 1863-1864. But if you think corrupt lawmen were the worst the frontier had to offer, wait until you meet the gang that turned train robbery into a military operation. Number 14, the Reno Brothers. This gang deserves recognition as America's first organized crime family, pioneering criminal techniques that wouldn't be seen again until the gangsters of the 1920s. Operating out of Seymour, Indiana, this gang didn't just commit crimes, they controlled an entire town and revolutionized criminal enterprise. Frank, William, John, and Simeon Reno turned Seymour into their personal kingdom. Local law enforcement was either corrupted or intimidated into submission, and honest citizens lived in constant fear. The brothers operated with a level of organization that was unprecedented in American criminal history. What made the Reno brothers truly innovative was their systematic approach to crime. They organized the first train robbery in American history on October 6, 1866, stopping an Ohio and Mississippi Railroad train and making off with over $13,000. But this wasn't a spontaneous crime. It was the result of weeks of planning, inside information, and military-style execution. The gang operated like a modern criminal enterprise, with specialized roles for each member. They had scouts who identified targets, insiders who provided information about valuable shipments, and enforcers who eliminated threats. They maintained detailed records of their operations and even had accountants who managed their stolen wealth. Their most audacious operation was the 1868 robbery of a Jefferson, Madison, and Indianapolis train carrying $96,000 in gold coins, equivalent to over $2 million today. This single heist netted them more money than most people earned in a lifetime, but it also marked the beginning of their downfall. The surviving brothers were eventually captured and executed, but their criminal innovations lived on, influencing organized crime for generations to come. But even the Reno brothers' sophisticated operation couldn't match the sheer brutality of our next gang. If you're as fascinated by these hidden Wild West stories as we are, go ahead and hit that like button. It's the best way to let us know you want more. And if you're new here, consider subscribing for deeper dives into the weapons, outlaws, and legends the history books left behind. Number 13, the Harpy Brothers. Before the Wild West was even wild, Makaja, Big, Harp and Wiley Little Harp were pioneering new depths of criminal depravity. These brothers weren't just outlaws. They were America's first serial killers, terrorizing the frontier for over a decade, with crimes so savage that they shocked even hardened frontiersmen. What made the Harp brothers truly terrifying was their complete lack of rational motive. While other outlaws robbed for money or killed in self-defense, the Harps murdered for pure pleasure. They would torture victims for hours before killing them, often dismembering the bodies and scattering the parts to maximize psychological impact. Their signature method was disembowelment. They would cut open their victims' stomachs, remove the organs, and fill the cavity with stones before throwing the bodies into rivers. This gruesome practice earned them the nickname the River Pirates, though they operated far from any major waterways. The brothers traveled with two women they claimed as wives, along with several children. This traveling family provided perfect cover, allowing them to approach unsuspecting victims who would never suspect a family group of harboring such monsters. They would often pose as religious pilgrims or traveling merchants to gain their victims' trust. One of their most horrific crimes occurred in 1799 when they murdered Moses Stegel's wife and infant child while Stegel was away hunting. When Stegel returned to find his family butchered, he joined the posse that eventually tracked down Big Harp. The posse's leader, John Leiper, shot Big Harp from his horse, and Stegel personally cut off the dying man's head with a butcher knife. If you think that level of savagery was unique to the early frontier, prepare yourself for a gang that brought industrial-scale murder to the Wild West. Number 12, the Bender family. They operated what appeared to be a simple inn and general store in southeastern Kansas. But behind their welcoming facade lay one of the most diabolical murder operations in American history. This wasn't just a gang. It was a family business built on systematic murder. The family consisted of John Bender Sr., his wife Elvira, their son John Jr., and their daughter Kate. Kate served as the family's spokesperson, known for her beauty and claimed psychic abilities. She would lure travelers into their establishment with promises of hot meals, comfortable lodging, and spiritual readings. While guests sat at the dining table with their backs to the curtain, one of the Bender men would position himself behind the canvas with a sledgehammer. At Kate's signal, usually when she asked if the guest wanted more coffee, he would strike the victim's skull with devastating force. If the first blow didn't kill them, they would finish the job with knives. The family would then rob the corpses, strip them naked, and bury them in their vegetable garden behind the inn. The garden's unusual fertility became locally famous, with neighbors commenting on how well the Benders' vegetables grew. For 3 years, they murdered at least 11 people, though some historians believe the true number could be as high as 21. The Bender operation was discovered in March 1873, when Dr. William York disappeared while traveling through the area. York's brother, a Kansas state senator, organized a massive search, that eventually led to the Bender property. When they dug up the garden, they found a horror scene that shocked even hardened frontier lawmen. The bodies showed signs of torture, and some victims had been buried while still alive. The discovery revealed that the Benders had been operating their murder inn for years, carefully selecting victims who carried significant amounts of money and wouldn't be missed immediately. But as methodical as the Benders were, they were small-time operators compared to the next gang on our list. Number 11, the Doolin-Dalton Gang. Bill Doolin created what many consider the last great outlaw gang of the Wild West, assembling a criminal organization that waged war against law and order across the Oklahoma Territory. The Doolin-Dalton Gang didn't just rob banks and trains. They challenged the very concept of government authority in the lawless territories. Doolin formed his gang from survivors of the infamous Dalton Gang after their catastrophic attempted double bank robbery in Coffeyville, Kansas. He recruited additional members who were among the deadliest gunfighters of the era: Bitter Creek, George Newcomb, Charlie Pierce, Redbuck, George Waitman, Dynamite Dick, Dan Clifton, and Arkansas Tom, Roy Doherty. What made this gang truly terrifying was their military-style organization and tactics. Most members were Civil War veterans who brought battlefield experience to their criminal activities. They operated with coordinated precision, using superior firepower and numbers to overwhelm any opposition. The gang's signature tactic was the coordinated assault. During robberies, they would position members at strategic points around the target, creating crossfire zones that made escape impossible for anyone who resisted. They used the latest weapons available, including high-powered rifles and dynamite, giving them technological advantages over most law enforcement. Their most notorious crime was the 1893 Battle of Ingalls, where they engaged in a prolonged gun battle with a posse of deputy U.S. Marshals. The fight lasted several hours and left 3 lawmen dead, along with multiple civilians caught in the crossfire. The gang's ability to fight off a coordinated law enforcement assault demonstrated their military capabilities. Their downfall came through a coordinated federal campaign involving multiple agencies. The U.S. Marshals Service organized special task forces armed with the latest weapons and unlimited authority to pursue the gang across territorial boundaries. One by one, the gang members were tracked down and killed in shootouts, with Doolin himself falling in 1896. But as dangerous as the Doolin-Dalton Gang was, they pale in comparison to the next group, whose crimes shocked the entire nation. Number 10, the Rufus Buck Gang. Led by Rufus Buck, a Creek Indian, the gang included Mayoma July, Sam Sampson, Lucky Davis, and Lewis Davis. Most were teenagers or young men in their early 20s, but their youth didn't diminish their capacity for extreme violence. They committed their crime spree during July 1896, terrorizing the territory with seemingly random acts of brutality. What made the Rufus Buck Gang particularly terrifying was their complete unpredictability. They didn't follow the typical outlaw pattern of targeting banks, trains, or wealthy victims. Instead, they seemed to kill anyone they encountered, regardless of age, race, or economic status. Their crime spree appeared motivated by pure bloodlust, rather than any rational criminal goal. In their 13-day rampage, they committed over 20 major crimes, including multiple murders, assaults, and robberies. They would attack isolated homesteads, torture the inhabitants, and burn the buildings. Their victims included men, women, and children from various ethnic backgrounds, suggesting that their violence was completely indiscriminate. Their most notorious crime was the murder of Deputy U.S. Marshal John Garrett, who had attempted to arrest them for an earlier robbery. The gang ambushed Garrett on a lonely road, shooting him multiple times and leaving his body as a warning to other law enforcement officers. The gang's random violence terrorized the entire territory. Families abandoned their homesteads and fled to larger towns for protection. Local newspapers described a reign of terror that had gripped the region, with residents afraid to travel even short distances alone. The massive manhunt that followed involved over 100 officers and Indian police, led by legendary Deputy Marshal Bass Reeves. The gang was tracked through the wilderness and eventually cornered near Muskogee. After a brief shootout, all 5 members were captured alive. The Rufus Buck Gang's story reveals the random violence that could erupt on the frontier and the thin line between civilization and chaos in the territories. But even these young killers couldn't match the systematic violence of our next gang. Number 9, the John Wesley Hardin Gang. John Wesley Hardin assembled around himself one of the most deadly collections of gunfighters and killers in the history of the American West. Hardin himself was credited with killing over 40 men before his 25th birthday, and his gang attracted equally violent criminals who terrorized Texas for nearly a decade. What made Hardin truly terrifying wasn't just his speed with a gun, but his complete lack of moral restraint. He would kill men for minor insults, perceived slights, or simply because he didn't like their appearance. His philosophy was simple: never back down from a fight, and never let an enemy live to seek revenge. Hardin's gang specialized in cattle rustling and protection rackets, but their real business was violence. They would hire themselves out as enforcers to wealthy ranchers and politicians who needed their enemies eliminated. Their reputation was so fearsome that simply mentioning Hardin's name was often enough to settle disputes in their clients' favor. The gang played a significant role in the Taylor-Sutton feud, one of the bloodiest range wars in Texas history. Hardin's men essentially served as a private army in this conflict, which lasted several years and claimed over 200 lives. They murdered dozens of people on both sides, turning what should have been a legal dispute into a bloodbath. The gang's most notorious incident was the killing of Deputy Sheriff Charles Webb in Comanche, Texas, in 1874. Webb had come to arrest Hardin, but the gunfighter shot him down in the street. The killing sparked outrage throughout Texas and led to increased efforts to capture the gang. Hardin was eventually captured by Texas Rangers in 1877 and sentenced to 25 years in prison. Without his leadership and reputation, the gang quickly dispersed. Hardin spent 15 years in prison, where he studied law and claimed to have reformed. However, he was shot and killed in an El Paso saloon in 1896, just 4 years after his release. But individual gunfighters, no matter how deadly, couldn't match the organized terror of our next gang. Number 8, Quantrill's Raiders. William Clark. Quantrill created what was officially a Confederate guerrilla unit during the Civil War, but in reality was one of the most savage terrorist organizations in American history. Quantrill's Raiders didn't just fight Union forces, they waged total war against civilian populations, pioneering tactics that shocked both sides of the conflict. What made Quantrill's Raiders truly terrifying was their complete abandonment of the laws of war. They didn't take prisoners, they didn't spare civilians, and they didn't distinguish between combatants and non-combatants. Their raids were exercises in systematic extermination, designed to terrorize Union sympathizers into submission or flight. The Raiders' most notorious crime was the Lawrence Massacre of August 21, 1863. They rode into the Kansas town at dawn and systematically murdered every man and boy they could find. In 4 hours, they killed over 150 people and burned 185 buildings, leaving the town in smoking ruins. The massacre was planned and executed with military precision. Quantrill had detailed intelligence about the town's layout and had prepared lists of specific targets, They moved through Lawrence methodically, searching every building and executing anyone they found. They specifically targeted men and boys to eliminate future resistance. The raiders operated with a brutality that shocked even Confederate leadership. They would scalp their victims, mutilate bodies, and commit atrocities that violated every convention of warfare. Their reputation for savagery preceded them, often causing Union forces to flee rather than face them in battle. After the Civil War ended, many of Quantrill's veterans turned to crime, forming some of the most notorious outlaw gangs of the Wild West. Their military training and complete moral corruption made them exceptionally dangerous criminals who continued terrorizing the frontier for decades. Quantrill himself was killed in Kentucky in 1865, but his legacy of violence lived on through his followers. The James Younger Gang and other outlaw organizations traced their origins directly to Quantrill's raiders, continuing their tradition of savage criminality well into the 1880s. But even Quantrill's organized terrorism couldn't match the scale and sophistication of our next gang. Number 7, the Cook Gang. Bill Cook assembled one of the most feared criminal organizations in the Oklahoma Territory, creating a gang that combined the ruthlessness of earlier outlaw bands with the organizational sophistication of modern crime syndicates. The Cook Gang terrorized the territory for over 2 years, committing crimes across multiple states and challenging federal authority. Cook recruited his gang from the most dangerous criminals in the territory, including Cherokee Bill, one of the most feared gunfighters of the era. Cherokee Bill alone was credited with killing over a dozen men and was known for his complete lack of mercy toward anyone who opposed the gang. What made the Cook Gang particularly dangerous was their multi-ethnic composition and their knowledge of the territory's complex geography. The gang included Native Americans, African Americans, and whites who could blend into different communities and exploit the jurisdictional confusion that plagued law enforcement in the territories. The gang operated with military-style discipline and planning. They would scout targets for weeks, create detailed escape routes, and coordinate their attacks with precision timing. They maintained multiple hideouts throughout the territory and had an extensive network of supporters who provided supplies and information. Their most audacious crime was the 1894 robbery of a Missouri Pacific train near Coretta, Oklahoma. The gang stopped the train with a fake distress signal, then systematically robbed all the passengers and looted the express car. They escaped with over $4,000 and successfully evaded the massive posse that pursued them. The Cook Gang's influence extended beyond simple criminality. They corrupted local officials, intimidated witnesses, and created a climate of fear throughout much of the territory. Local newspapers described their activities as guerrilla warfare against civilization itself. The Cook Gang's story demonstrates how criminal organizations adapted to the changing frontier, using new technologies and organizational methods to challenge law enforcement with unprecedented effectiveness. But sophisticated organization couldn't protect our next gang from the consequences of their extreme violence. Number 6, the Wild Bunch. While Hollywood romanticized their story, the reality was far more complex and dangerous than any movie dared to show. What made the Wild Bunch truly formidable was their combination of military precision and criminal innovation. Most gang members were experienced cowboys and former soldiers who brought professional skills to their criminal activities. They operated like a modern criminal corporation with specialized roles, extensive planning, and coordinated operations across multiple states. The gang's headquarters was the famous Hole-in-the-Wall hideout in Wyoming, a natural fortress surrounded by cliffs with only one narrow entrance. This remote valley served as their base of operations, complete with supplies, fresh horses, and defensive positions that made it virtually impregnable to law enforcement attack. Butch Cassidy, whose real name was Robert Leroy Parker, was a master strategist who planned every operation with meticulous attention to detail. He would scout targets for weeks, create multiple escape routes with fresh horses stationed at precise intervals, and coordinate timing down to the minute. The gang revolutionized train robbery techniques, using dynamite with surgical precision to open express cars without destroying the contents. Their 1899 robbery of the Union Pacific Overland Flyer near Wilcox, Wyoming, netted them over $30,000 and demonstrated their technical expertise. The gang maintained an extensive network of supporters throughout the West, including ranchers, saloon keepers, and even some law enforcement officers who provided safe houses, supplies, and information. This network made them nearly impossible to track and gave them advance warning of law enforcement operations. Their most famous robbery was the 1901 heist of the Great Northern Train near Wagner, Montana, where they escaped with over $40,000. The robbery was executed with such precision that it became a textbook example of criminal planning and execution. Their story marks the end of the classic outlaw era, as the frontier became too civilized and law enforcement too sophisticated for traditional gang operations to succeed. But even the Wild Bunch's sophisticated methods couldn't match the sheer terror inspired by our next gang. Number 5, the Mason Gang. Samuel Mason led one of the most powerful and brutal criminal organizations in early American history, controlling vast sections of the Mississippi River and terrorizing travelers for over a decade. The Mason Gang operated during the lawless period following the Revolutionary War, when government authority was weak and criminals could operate with virtual impunity. What made the Mason Gang particularly terrifying was their control over river traffic. They operated from Cave-in Rock, a massive natural cave overlooking the Ohio River that served as their fortress and headquarters. From this strategic position, they could attack any vessel that passed, making river travel extremely dangerous. The gang's methods were systematically brutal. They would signal to passing boats, pretending to be stranded travelers in need of help. When vessels approached the shore, the gang would emerge from hiding and massacre everyone aboard. They rarely left survivors, believing that dead men tell no tales. Mason maintained discipline within his organization through fear and violence. Gang members who showed any sign of disloyalty or cowardice were executed without trial. He operated multiple bases along the river system, allowing the gang to strike across hundreds of miles of territory. The gang's most notorious crime was the massacre of the entire crew and passenger list of the keelboat Adventure in 1797. Over 30 people were murdered, and their bodies were thrown into the river. The crime shocked the frontier and led to increased military patrols along the waterways. The gang's influence extended far beyond simple piracy. They corrupted local officials, intimidated witnesses, and maintained their own informal government in the regions they controlled. Local settlers paid tribute to the gang rather than risk attack. Mason's downfall came when he was betrayed by his own men. Wiley Harp murdered Mason to collect the bounty on his head, bringing the gang to an end in 1803. The Mason Gang's reign of terror lasted over a decade and claimed hundreds of lives. But territorial control couldn't save our next gang from the consequences of their extreme brutality. Number 4, the Younger Brothers. Gang. Cole, Jim, John, and Bob formed one of the most feared criminal organizations of the post-Civil War era. Veterans of Quantrill's Raiders, they brought military discipline and guerrilla warfare tactics to frontier crime, terrorizing Missouri and surrounding states for over a decade. What made the Younger Brothers particularly dangerous was their combination of military training and personal motivation. They claimed to be fighting a continuation of the Civil War, targeting banks and businesses that they associated with Union sympathizers and Northern capitalism. The gang operated with military precision, using coordinated attacks, disciplined retreats and sophisticated intelligence gathering. They would scout targets for weeks, identify escape routes, and plan contingencies for various scenarios. Their military background gave them tactical advantages that most law enforcement couldn't match. Cole Younger, the gang's leader, was a master strategist who combined the ruthlessness of a guerrilla fighter with the organizational skills of a cavalry officer. He maintained strict discipline within the gang and demanded absolute loyalty from his followers. The gang's most notorious crime was their participation in the 1876 attempted bank robbery in Northfield, Minnesota. The robbery went disastrously wrong when townspeople fought back, leading to a running gun battle that left 2 gang members dead and several wounded. The Younger brothers were captured, but Jesse and Frank James escaped. What set the Younger brothers apart from other gangs was their political motivation. They saw themselves as Confederate soldiers, continuing the war by other means, targeting symbols of Union authority and Northern economic power. This political dimension gave them support among Confederate sympathizers. After their capture in Minnesota, the surviving Younger brothers spent decades in prison. They were eventually paroled and became something of folk heroes among those who romanticized the Old West. Their story became part of the mythology of frontier resistance to federal authority. But even the Younger brothers' military discipline couldn't match the organized terror of our next gang. Number 3, the James Younger Gang. For 15 years, they terrorized the American Midwest with a campaign of robbery and violence that captured national attention and inspired countless imitators. The gang's formation grew directly out of the Civil War guerrilla conflict in Missouri. Most members were veterans of Confederate irregular units, particularly Quantrill's Raiders and Bloody Bill Anderson's band. They brought military discipline and guerrilla tactics to their criminal activities. Their first confirmed robbery was the Clay County Savings Association in Liberty, Missouri, on February 13, 1866. This robbery is often considered the first daylight bank robbery by a mounted gang in U.S. history. The gang escaped with over $60,000 and established the pattern they would follow for years. What made them particularly dangerous was their willingness to kill. During their robbery of the bank in Gallatin, Missouri, in 1869, they shot and killed cashier John Sheets, whom they mistakenly believed was the Union officer who had killed Bloody Bill Anderson. This murder showed their willingness to execute personal vendettas. The gang expanded their operations to include train robberies, pioneering techniques that would be copied by outlaws for decades. Their first train robbery was the Rock Island Railroad near Adair, Iowa, in 1873. They removed rails to derail the train, then robbed the passengers and express car. The gang's most notorious crime was the attempted robbery of the First National Bank of Northfield, Minnesota, in 1876. The robbery failed when townspeople fought back, leading to a running gun battle that decimated the gang. Several members were killed or captured, effectively ending the original organization. After Northfield, Jesse James formed a new gang and continued his criminal career until 1883, when he was shot and killed by Robert Ford, a gang member seeking reward money. The James Younger Gang's legacy influenced outlaw culture for generations and established many of the traditions associated with American banditry. But even the famous James Gang couldn't match the sheer scope and organization of our next group. Got thoughts or theories? Drop them in the comments below. We read everyone, and your comment could even get featured in the next episode. And if you haven't yet, hit that subscribe button and join our growing Wild West community. We're just getting started. Number 2, the Cassidy Gang Network. While Butch Cassidy's Wild Bunch was the most famous component, the larger Cassidy Gang Network represented the most sophisticated criminal organization in the history of the American West. This network included multiple affiliated gangs, extensive supply chains, and coordinated operations across dozens of states and territories. The network operated more like a modern crime syndicate, than a traditional outlaw gang. Cassidy served as the overall coordinator, but individual cells operated independently while sharing resources, information, and personnel. This structure made the network extremely difficult for law enforcement to dismantle completely. The core of the network included the Wild Bunch, but also affiliated groups like the Ketchum Gang, Harvey Logan's crew, and dozens of smaller outlaw bands scattered across the West. These groups would coordinate major operations while maintaining operational security through compartmentalized communication. What made the network truly revolutionary was its logistics system. They maintained supply caches across the West, including weapons, ammunition, food, and fresh horses. These caches were positioned to support operations and provide escape routes across thousands of miles of territory. The network's intelligence system was equally sophisticated. They had informants in law enforcement agencies, railroad companies, banks, and telegraph offices. This intelligence network provided advance warning of law enforcement operations and detailed information about potential targets. Butch Cassidy's genius lay in his ability to coordinate these diverse criminal elements into a coherent organization. He established protocols for communication, standardized operational procedures, and created a system for sharing profits and resources among affiliated groups. The network's most audacious operation was the coordinated campaign against the Union Pacific Railroad in 1899-1901. Multiple affiliated gangs struck Union Pacific trains across several states within a 6-month period, making it appear that a single gang was operating simultaneously in impossible locations. The network's downfall came from the same modernization that ended the frontier era: improved communication, better law enforcement coordination, and the arrival of automobiles gradually made their horse-based operations obsolete. By 1905, most network members had been killed, captured, or forced to flee the country. But even this sophisticated criminal empire couldn't match the sheer terror and brutality of our final gang. Number 1. The Apache Kid Gang. At the top of our list is a gang so savage and elusive that they became legendary throughout the Southwest. The Apache Kid Gang, led by the Apache warrior known only as the Kid, combined the guerrilla warfare skills of Apache fighters with the criminal methods of frontier outlaws, creating the most feared organization in the history of the American West. The gang operated with a level of stealth and mobility that made them nearly impossible to track. They could cover 100 miles in a single day on foot, navigate by stars across trackless desert, and survive for weeks on minimal food and water. These skills, learned through generations of Apache tradition, gave them enormous advantages over pursuing posses. Their signature tactic was the lightning raid. They would appear without warning at isolated ranches, trading posts, or mining camps, kill everyone present, take what they wanted, and disappear before help could arrive. The speed and completeness of these attacks created a climate of terror throughout the territory. The gang's most notorious crime was the 1889 massacre at the Peck Ranch near Globe, Arizona. They killed the entire family of parents and 3 children, then burned the buildings and drove off the livestock. The brutality of the attack shocked even hardened frontiersmen who were accustomed to violence. The gang maintained no permanent base, instead moving constantly across the vast desert territories. They knew every waterhole, every hidden canyon, and every escape route across hundreds of thousands of square miles. This mobility made them effectively uncatchable by conventional law enforcement. Law enforcement's inability to stop the Apache Kid Gang led to the deployment of regular Army units and Apache scouts specifically tasked with hunting them down. Even these specialized forces struggled against an enemy who knew the terrain better than anyone and could disappear at will. Various reports claim the Apache Kid was finally killed in the 1890s, but his body was never recovered, and sightings continued well into the 20th century. Some historians believe he survived until the 1930s, making him the last of the great frontier outlaws. Thanks for riding with us through the Wild West's most brutal weapons. If this episode fired up your curiosity, give it a thumbs up and share it with a fellow history buff. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our next deep dive into the untold stories of the American frontier.